It's great to welcome to the program today Wendy Brown, who's a professor of political science at UC Berkeley and also author most recently of In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. Wendy, so great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So first, just so we're all hopefully working with the sort of same definition of neoliberalism, I think it's a much understood and debated term. In the context that you write about it, what are the important tenets that define neoliberalism?
So, just to be clear to start with, because I do think it's confusing to many Americans,
Yes.
by neoliberalism, the original neoliberals, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and others, were referring to a modification of economic liberalism. And I only want to make that clear because still so many Americans imagine that it has something to do with our notion of political liberalism, where it has to do with more equality, more social spending, more state, and so forth. And it's just the opposite. Neoliberalism, as the founding fathers of it thought about neoliberalism, meant taking the basic principles of economic liberalism, that is, unregulated markets, maximized competition, and modifying those. And the modifications that they imagined and that actually have come to be involved two things. One, understanding that markets are not necessarily natural, even if they're good. So they need a lot of state support. They don't need state intervention, but they need state support. They need the state oriented to the issue of making markets work and making markets thrive. And the other thing that they did to modify the original Adam Smith notions of liberalism had to do with bringing traditional morality into the picture, understanding that not just markets, but also morals were what ought to be organizing social life, cultural life, familial life, and so forth. And the reason I emphasize that is that so many of us talk about neoliberalism just as a set of economic policies, but we need to understand that it also has this other dimension, a dimension that, of course, has really come to the fore as we think about contemporary political life.
Yeah, I mean, what was the trajectory of that in history? Because it's not necessarily obvious that what starts as a set of economic principles would eventually come to encompass a particular view about so-called, traditional family values, or that it would dictate certain foreign policy, as often is a part of discussions about neoliberal versus other points of view. What was the trajectory through which those elements became wrapped up in this sort of bigger understanding of neoliberalism in the last 20 or 30 years?
The fundamental attack that neoliberalism makes on the social state, on Keynesianism, on practices of social justice that have to do with legislation of the good. The fundamental attack that neoliberalism makes is this. It says, better that what we have is just organically developed morality and markets organizing society. And that means less democratic legislation. In fact, the neoliberals were extremely suspicious of and really tried to modify and diminish the extent to which legislatures in electoral democracies should do anything other than just set general laws for people. So they really wanted legislators out of the social justice business, out of the market regulation business, and certainly out of the taxation business. So those two things come together, morality and market, in the attack that neoliberals make on democratic ways of deciding how we should live together, how much equality we should have, how much inclusion we should have, how we ought to deal with things like gender power, racial power, class power, and so forth. All of those the neoliberals wanted left alone so that traditional morality and markets could govern our lives. And they believed that that would maximize freedom and maximize the good, maximize a good society.
Yeah, one of the things that is interesting to me, as I understand it, and I'm curious if you believe that the same kind of inherent contradiction exists, is that in a lot of the ideology that's espoused about neoliberalism and these free market, less regulation, increasing freedom, the language is very much about getting out of the way to allow more liberty to exist. But in practice, that getting out of the way, to the extent that it exists, and of course it's much more complicated than that, can actually allow a lot of different types of authoritarianism to take
Exactly.
hold in different ways. Is that a contradiction that you agree exists there?
Well, for them, it's not a contradiction for the
Ah,
following reason. For us, it seems that way. How come what starts as a project or a program of freedom ends up in the kind of authoritarianism that we see in the Bolsonaro regime? Many of us argue is taking shape under Trump and Erdogan and so forth.
yes.
But for inside a neoliberal frame, the thinking goes like this: it's okay to have strong states as long as you maximize individual liberty. Strong states are the way that you will ensure that individuals can engage in market conduct and have the moral life, the social life that they choose. But what a state must not do is intervene in individual freedoms. So to put this in fairly simple language, what neoliberals thought was all right was a form of what we might call authoritarian liberalism. That is, a strong state making decisions indifferent to what we call the checks and balances and three branches of government and all of that. A strong state making decisions, but leaving alone private life, leaving alone individual life. And that's what really distinguishes the authoritarian liberalism taking shape today and that many on the right support from classic fascism, where
Yeah, and well, the other thing
state,
that's interesting to me there is there's a lot of overlap between that ideology and sort of what we might consider traditional right libertarianism, not social libertarianism, but right libertarianism,
exactly.
except when it comes to foreign policy, neoliberalism has been much more interventionist than the right libertarians at least claim that they would be. I don't know that they've ever really gotten a shot to show us how non-interventionist they would be. But that in practice seems to be a very big distinguishing factor. Despite the talk of freedom and the individual liberty being the most important form of it, neoliberalism has been extraordinarily interventionist in terms of foreign policy.
Correct. Now, here again, just if I'm to try to explain what neoliberals think they're doing,
Yes.
what they imagine they're trying to do is create a world of global free trade. Now, what's happening right now is another story with the trade wars and so forth. But what the classic neoliberal foreign policy advocates thought they were doing, for example, in Iraq, regime change in Iraq, and then neoliberalize the society, make it into part of the global order of, among other things, debt financing and free trade and so forth. So you're absolutely right that they understand a highly interventionist foreign policy as part of what is bringing about the neoliberal order. But there's one other area that I would emphasize where the kind of markets and morals program of the neoliberals seems to really intervene in individual liberty, and that's of course um, reproductive freedom and LGBT rights. And again, the official thinking here is, well, that has to do with the moral order. These things go against traditional morality, which is tried and true and belongs part and parcel with a free market society. So it's slippery there, but there you really do have a contradiction. Lots of intervention in the freedom of um, women and non-normative sexualities saying, no, you can't do that.
There is we could call it the hope among many on the American left that socially democratic ideas that are similar to those of the Scandinavian economies,
Yeah,
Northern Europe, etc., are experiencing maybe a resurgence, a renaissance of sorts, or maybe approaching something new that maybe we've not even seen before in the United States. And that the rise of those ideas will necessarily push out some of the neoliberal framework that has been the status quo for a long time. Is it as clear as if one goes up, the other goes down? Is it more complicated than that? Do you even agree that that's actually a trend that we're now seeing?
I do think that there has been a fairly robust challenge to neoliberal ideas really since the 2008 finance capital meltdown. I mean, that
Mm.
was the beginning of the end of a broad endorsement of free markets, privatization, minimal social state, depression of progressive taxation. The post 2008 rethink went beyond Occupy, although Occupy really embodied it. That and what we need to remember is that, however limited the actual time frame of Occupy Wall Street, what it did was begin to change the conversation about inequality, about access to public education, higher education, about banks being given free reign to do whatever they wanted, about bailing out the banks but not the foreclosed homeowners, and so forth. So, with that conversation now changed, you get the rise of Bernie Sanders and in turn AOC and Elizabeth Warren and so forth, such that I would actually agree that what you have is a fairly robust challenge now to neoliberal economic ideas, but I would say a little bit less savvy on the part of the left about the extent to which neoliberalism is also bound up with this idea that the state should stay out of the moral realm, by which is meant the social justice realm. Again, the left has certainly been robust on the subject of arguing for gender rights, LGBT rights, Black civil rights, endorsing all kinds of social movements. But I do think it's the part of the story that's more complicated is taking apart that broad belief that neoliberalism set into the bones of society, that it's best for the state to be out of the business of social justice, redistribution, social spending, and all the rest, and to just let those things be handled individually. So to compress the point, I do think that we have a pretty major challenge now to neoliberal economic thinking, but maybe not a full grasp of the way that what I call neoliberal reason has really come to organize a lot of our understanding of society and what's appropriate for democratic legislation.
Yeah, I've also found the challenge to be less robust when it comes to foreign policy. I mean,
Yeah.
you do hear, hey, we shouldn't be getting it. We're not the world's policemen. We should be getting out of here, there, the other place. But it's been a less sort of nuanced and well thought out challenge. I don't know if you would agree.
I totally agree. And I think that in many ways in the United States, Trump has really confused the left in its own rethinking,
Mm.
its own thinking about foreign policy, because he stands now for what the anti imperial left used to stand for, which is get out of the endless wars, don't be the world's policeman. Of course, he's trying to do all kinds of things at the level of trade and still engaged in massive, what we could call neo-colonial condemnation of all kinds of nations and practices. But the withdrawal that has typically been the stance of many on the left has really, I think, not been fully come to terms with by the left, to think about, okay, where does the left stand on the question of joining together with others in the world, not just to solve climate change, not just to get institutions of political economy right, but also to right wrongs. Where are we with human rights discourse? Where are we with humanitarian intervention? And the left has gone super quiet on those subjects.
Absolutely fascinating. We've been talking with Wendy Brown, who's professor of political science at UC Berkeley, most recently author of In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. Wendy, such a pleasure having you on. I appreciate your time.
David, it was good to talk to you. Thank you.